Hey, breaking points. Marshall here. I'm joined by Josh Mitchell of the Wall Street Journal. He recently wrote, which came out in paperback, The Debt Trap: How Student Loans Became a National Catastrophe, which makes him the perfect guest to do a quick follow up on last week's news. Josh, can you start by giving us a real rundown of where things stand now with the student loan system, given the Biden administration's reform?
Yeah, there are two big things that I think President Biden did here. He basically said that the government is going to forgive $10,000 for people who earn $10,000 in student debt for people who earn under $125,000 a year, $250,000 for couples, and um, and on top of that, if you received a Pell Grant, you can get up to $20,000 in forgiveness. Um, so that's the first thing, is that a lot of people are going to get a chunk of student debt forgiven. The second thing, which I think is very important but has not got as much attention, is going forward, if you take out loans to go to college, you can now pay only 5% of your discretionary income toward your student loans each month, and the interest will not accrue. And currently, you have the option to pay 10%. So basically, he's cutting in half the amount that families will have to pay down each month on their college debt, which is a very significant reduction in just how much people will end up having to pay back on their student debt.
I think your summary really gets at the tensions under the system now, because I see, especially that second reform, that's going to be great for families, for people with student loans, all those bits coming out of college. I'm not sure that making it easier to pay down ever increasing amounts of debts is going to be the right pressure on the university system to reform. So how should we think about kind of the dilemma and the tension there?
I have three broad bullet points when I think about what just happened. The first is the constitutionality of this move. The second is this idea of toxic debt, which I'll talk about. And the third is systemic reform. And so I'll go in order of those three things. The first involves the constitutionality. What is very remarkable here is that President Biden himself, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, certainly Republicans, basically every political figure involved here, have at one point or another raised very serious doubts about the ability of the executive branch, to wipe out what amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars in student debt wholesale. And so what's remarkable is that after months and the past couple years of President Biden himself having at some point raised doubts about his ability to do this, he's come out and done it. And I think that is very important to keep in mind here. That's like a broader story of the executive branch just, increasingly throughout different administrations using powers that are very dubious from a legal perspective. The second thing is
quick follow up on that. Was the student loan pause itself, was that through the executive branch or was that Congress?
Both. So President Trump, at the very start of the pandemic, used executive powers to pause student loans. He initially did it for a matter of months, to basically say, you don't have to make payments on student loans for the time being, and we will suspend the interest. So that was a big benefit for families that he did with executive powers. And then Congress codified it with this broad law that they passed early on in the pandemic. And then after that law expired, the Biden administration comes in and they basically continue to extend the, I'll call, pandemic pause multiple times. And so now the other thing he did was he said, look, we're going to extend it one more time through December 31st of this year, and then that's it. People will have to start making their payments. So it's a combination of both a law that Congress passed as well as executive authorities.
So this time there's just no law. It's just an executive decision saying
Correct.
we're going to forgive the loans. Okay, so yeah, get to the
Well,
second
and,
part
and
then.
just to
Yeah.
clarify, so, like they're arguing that this law passed in 2003 in the wake of the Iraq War, um, or at the start of the Iraq War, it authorizes this. So they're saying we are using existing law, but there's a lot of people who say, well, that's a misuse of that law. It was not intended to be used in this fashion.
So is it possible that this decision could be overturned, like interrupted? Is there any uncertainty about the actual implementation?
That's one of the very big questions here. When if someone were to sue, you would have to argue what their standing is. Basically, someone would have to say, I am harmed financially by this move. And so one question in my mind is, could some private institutions who have business with the federal government when it comes to lending, could they argue this somehow financially harms them? I really don't know. This is speculation on my part, but for example, and this gets a little bit in the weeds, but prior to 2010, there were a lot of people who had federal loans, but those loans were awarded by private lenders, and they were guaranteed by the federal government. And so, there is a certain amount of federal student debt that is actually on the books of private lenders. Not sure if this forgiveness applies to them, but let's just say that you have federal loans that are held by a private lender. You consolidate into a new federal loan, which is basically a form of refinancing, and then you get forgiveness. Could the private lender say, hey, I'm being harmed because I'm being denied a future revenue stream that under contract I am entitled to get. So I think that there's a really thorny question of who will have the ability to sue and what their argument will be, but it's certainly a possibility.
And then your second probably it was toxic debt.
Yes, so toxic debt I think is a really important point here. I don't think people realize the scale of what I will, call predatory lending or subprime lending that occurred in this program over the past 15 years. One of the things I've noticed on Twitter is that there's like these caricatures of student borrowers, on the right, and even among centrist Democrats, there's this focus on people who got a degree, went to graduate school, have a job, are getting the so-called wage premium. Why should they not have to pay back all of their debt? Far be it for me to argue for or against that argument. So that's one caricature, and then you have this other caricature of people mostly on the far left, the Bernie Sanders crowd, for the most part, saying this doesn't go far enough because everyone who has student debt is struggling, and why not just wipe it all out? $10,000 is not nearly enough, and everyone is burdened, and everyone who has student debt is just struggling. And I think that both of those are a little bit of a caricature. It's not that I think that both of those statements have kernels of truth in them, but as someone who's covered this for a long time, I view the student loan market as the national mortgage market. There are a lot of people who have mortgages that they use to buy houses in very wealthy areas like Westchester, New York, or Georgetown, Washington, D.C. And so, yes, there's a lot of quote unquote privileged, well-off people who got mortgages whose investments have paid off, and why should they have any forgiveness of mortgage debt? But then you also have like a lot of people, particularly think back to the housing crisis, who were in Arizona or West Virginia and bought houses at inflated values. They weren't really well informed about the debt product that they were getting into. Maybe they had an adjustable rate mortgage. Very quickly they defaulted on their loans. They were suddenly underwater. Their mortgages were higher than the value of their houses, which had gone down in the housing crash. And so, there's like the student debt market is the same way. You have people who took out loans to go to Princeton or to even go to the University of Maryland, my alma mater. Solid State School has great outcomes in terms of graduation rates and people getting jobs. But then you have a whole lot of people who went to community colleges, for-profit trade programs, a certain number of HBCUs, which are open enrollment. This group of schools, you can sort of categorize them as open enrollment schools, in that they don't really have any admission standards. And so basically anyone who's anyone, regardless of their academic ability, their walk of life, they enroll, the government gives them a blank check. A lot of these students, which were disproportionately drivers of student debt in the housing crisis and when student debt boomed, ended up dropping out. So they didn't get a degree, they never got a well-paying job, and they just instantly defaulted on their loans. Or maybe they did get a degree, they graduated into a historically weak labor market back in the early 2010s, and they weren't able to keep up on their payments. There's a big cohort of those people. And that's what I mean by toxic debt. And I'll just make one more point, because I know that I'm going on for a long time here, but
no, it's good. This is kind of the point.
Yeah, counterintuitively, most people who default on their loans owe relatively small amounts, between $5,000 and $10,000. And that's counterintuitive, because when we think of people who struggle with student debt, I think in the public discourse, it's, $50,000, $100,000. That's a big issue. We talked about this last time. But a lot of the toxic debt is people who, again, enrolled, spent a semester, and then dropped out. They never make a payment. Most people who default just never make a payment. They drop out of college, they fall off the radar. The loan servicers are hounding them with emails and phone calls. There's millions of these people who their debt is just sitting on the government's books, and the government and Congress just pretend like it's going to get paid at some point. And so when people say $10,000, like, that's not a lot, one of the things that I think about is, this is just going to, in one fell swoop, wipe out all of that toxic debt that years ago a private lender or a bankruptcy judge would have done. So, notwithstanding the constitutionality, practically speaking, I think this takes off a lot of toxic debt. So that's point number 2, and I'll stop there if you have any follow-up questions on that.
No, I think you covered it. What's the third and final systemic reform point?
The third and final systemic reform gets to this, partly to this income-driven repayment benefit that was included here. Basically, it's the idea of moral hazard. And I think a lot of progressives that I've followed in this debate, I think they think of this idea of moral hazard as this like esoteric economic theoretical problem that, Milton Friedman-esque types worry about. I actually think it's a very big issue here. And I think if you look at how colleges behave, they have been able to raise their prices at such high levels because no one really suffers negative consequences, at least from the school's perspective, when they encourage students to overborrow. And I think that this might make this worse. This really risks making that perverse incentive worse. If colleges can now go to students and say, don't worry about the balance, yeah, you're going to have to take out $50,000 on the front end. I know that sounds like a lot, but look, when you come out, you're only going to have to pay 5% of your discretionary income. So whether it's $50,000 or $75,000, you're never going to pay this all back. I think that that's a very serious issue. Some colleges have already done that. Basically, they're counseling students on how to take advantage of these options so that they desensitize students to the high tuition. And so what I find very remarkable here is this is in some ways the opposite of what happened in the housing crisis. In the housing crisis, you had a lot of people who took out a lot of debt that they overborrowed. And the government, I think there's a consensus that the government didn't do enough to help out individual homeowners, but that the government focused a lot on systemic reform. So they created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they passed Dodd-Frank, they increased requirements for how much banks should hold in capital. They did all of these things to, focus on, at least from their perspective, fixing the lending system so that going forward there would not be, such reckless lending that presented a systemic risk to the U.S. economy. Here, it's like it flips the script. Here, the government has done a lot for individual student debtors. They've paused their payments for 3 years, interest free. They've forgiven $10,000 or in some cases $20,000 in debt. They've cut in half how much college people with college debt are going to have to pay going forward each month. So they've done a lot on top of the stimulus that the government provided for households to get through the pandemic. They've done a lot for individuals. They've done nothing to solve the systemic problems, and they're just like ignoring that. And based on historical trends and based on the government's own projections, we're going to have, as a country, another $1.6 trillion in student debt within a few years. So I think it's really remarkable, the lack of focus from this administration or Congress on some of the broader issues.
And I guess my reaction as we close it is it's either we got a do-over in a few years, which is probably both not a great thing from a systemic problem issue, but also I think it presents an opportunity to learn from this current experience, the way you put it. Josh, this is really great. Can you do a quick shout out to the debt trap for anyone who wants to like dive deeper into this issue?
Yeah, so please, by all means, buy my book, bit.ly/debt trap book. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it in independent bookstores. The paperback just came out. It goes over the whole history. I think it's very important to really understand how we got here, why we're here, and I think I try to unpack all of these various issues in detail. It also has, if you're a history buff, just a lot of stuff about how Sputnik launched this whole program in the first place. So yeah, please, by all means.
Josh, thank you for joining us on Breaking Points.
Yes, thank you. I love being here. Thank you.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.